Hello there. I'm Karthik Rajan, and today is the 14th of January. There are 294 days left until Election Day, and here I'm covering Vote Count 2020. I'm talking about and considering the manner in which we vote, the mechanics of voting, and machines that are being used, and the way votes are being cast and or maybe purged in some instances. And today, the Elections Assistance Commission, a commission that was created by the HAVA Act, the Help America Vote Act of 2002, is having an election summit in Washington, D.C. They're there all day long, and they have different panels. And we've been watching it all day today. And now we're going to take a listen as the next group comes in.
Welcome back, everyone. Please take your seats. Hello again, I'm Christy McCormick, and it's my pleasure to moderate our next panel, Securing the 2020 Elections. Following the 2016 elections, election security has become a front and center issue in the minds of election administrators, lawmakers, national security and intelligence officials, and the public at large. The heightened focus on election security following the 2016 election has brought new actors to the election space. This includes the Department of Homeland Security, intelligence and law enforcement officials, state National Guard units, and dozens of cybersecurity-focused companies and non-governmental organizations. We like to joke in the office that there are now more election cybersecurity beat reporters than there are staff at the EAC. I suspect many of them are here in the audience today. You can hardly open a newspaper or watch a newscast these days without seeing reference to foreign interference in elections, election disinformation, and cybersecurity threats to the various election systems. Navigating this new environment has presented challenges for election officials, but we've come a long way since 2016, and let me assure you that election officials and their partners are working tirelessly to strengthen U.S. election infrastructure, protect election systems from cybersecurity threats, and bolster public confidence in the election process. Alongside our federal partners, we at the EAC are proud to support these efforts and assist state and local election officials as they work to address these critical issues. I also want to say that we were heartened by last month's passage of the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which included $425 million in new HAVA funds for the states. The EAC is doing everything in its power to make this funding available to states as quickly as possible, just as we did with the $380 million in HAVA funds appropriated in 2018. The EAC Grants Office expects to send award packets to state grant recipients later this month. Additionally, the EAC is continuing to actively participate in the Elections Infrastructure Government Coordinating Council, advance the next generation of voluntary voting systems guidelines for voting system testing and certification, known as VVSG 2.0, conduct research that is relevant to the election security problem set. I am pleased to be joined today by an esteemed panel of election security experts, including two election officials who serve with me on the GCC Executive Committee. To my left here, to your right, is Jeff Hale, the Director of Election Security Initiative at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS. Jeff also serves on the EAC Technical Guidelines Development Committee. Next to him is Keith Ingram, the Director for the Elections Division of the Office of the Texas Secretary of State. Keith is the current president of the National Association of State Election Directors. He also serves on the EAC Standards Board. Next to Keith is David Stafford, who has served as the supervisor of elections in Escambia County, Florida since 2004. He is the past president of the Florida State Association of Supervisors of Elections and the current legislative chair of the National Association of Election Officials. And at the end there is Ron Bouchard, the vice president and chief technology officer for government solutions at FireEye. Each of our panelists will offer some initial remarks, followed by some questions from me, and then from you, the audience. So we'll start off with Jeff. Welcome, Jeff. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, especially with several members of the GCC For those of you that don't know, the Government Coordinating Council is a byproduct of the critical infrastructure designation. And it is the executive group that helps us at DHS understand the sector with more granularity, more detail. We turn to experts like the EAC, like state election directors, like local election directors, to help us understand their needs and risk posture, and understand where we as DHS can add value. So, as you referenced, in 2016, we were the new player to the community, and we were certainly caught kind of flat-footed by the incidents of 2016. We didn't necessarily communicate well. We were looking in a very reactive manner to try and add value in the manner that we support other critical infrastructure sectors. So we focused on things like vulnerability scanning or penetration testing, but really was maintaining situational awareness of what was going on with respect to Russia in 2016. We've learned so much more from that time, from the critical infrastructure designation in January of 2017. We have leaned on the expertise on the Government Coordinating Council and its partner panel, the Sector Coordinating Council, which is made up of the vendor community, to help educate us on where DHS can really add value. We kind of break that down into 3 areas. In the pre-election space, we go around and perform hundreds of assessments. If you don't know, we have a catalog out on the table out there of the type of assessments that we've provided. These are no cost, voluntary for election officials, for the vendor community. They help to inform the trends around around the election sector and prioritize our future activities. So with this data set, what we do is we take the emerging trends, start to work them into trainings, start to work them into exercises, which we go around and host. We've had more than 40. We do this. The last national tabletop exercise in the space had 47 states and more than 1,000 local election officials. This is really laying the groundwork for communications that hadn't existed in 2016. Building off of the broader data set that emerged from all of this the assessment work, we start to put that into practice in prioritizing the capabilities we can bring to bear. We help to establish the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center. That is the body that monitors intrusion detection sensors and net flow across election infrastructure in all 50 states, and has more than 2,400 local election officials as part of its membership. They also host a situational awareness room on election day, which really has the effect of bringing election officials from their location virtually to our operations center, so that anything that we know on election day, anything that is impacting elections across the country, can be shared and disseminated in near real time. The last element that we've done to help prioritize risk is we've seen that auditability is a key tenet of information security, and really one of the best controls and countermeasures for this sector. So in order to support effective and efficient audits, we funded a post-election audit, the development of a post-election audit tool, which is hosted on GitHub in an open source and free environment. With that, I look forward to your questions.
Keith?
So I wanted to take a minute to talk about what we've done in Texas since 2016. As you might know, our legislature meets every odd-numbered year and for about 150 days, and good luck trying to get a bill passed. But in 2017, there was a general cybersecurity bill that they put a section in there for our office to assess election infrastructure in Texas, to make a report to the legislature by December 1st of 2018 regarding vulnerabilities and our recommendations for helping to shore up some of those vulnerabilities. We, throughout the year, the rest of 2017 and 2018, did that assessment. It was purely a product of our office, but we talked to a lot of county election officials. We went out and did site visits at county election offices to try to figure out, what are some things that we could tell the legislature would help secure the process of elections in Texas. So we made our report December 1st, 2018. There was a member of the House Elections Committee in Texas, Celia Israel. She wanted to meet with us to discuss the report, to discuss our recommendations. So we had a pretty good, long and productive meeting with her. And she again said, happy to help any way I can, except, trying to pass a law because that's difficult. But she did file a bill, HB 1421, and it did, in fact, pass the legislative session in 2019. And HB 1421 basically implements our office's recommendations to improve election security in Texas. It does several things. Number one, it allows us to require users of our voter registration database, the statewide voter registration database and election management system, to have cyber hygiene training every year. So that was a big step. We now have the requirement that in order to access our system, you have to be trained at least at a minimum level with regard to cyber hygiene. The other thing it did, it requires our office to implement election security best practices. Our first iteration of that document is going to be published probably later this week, maybe early next week. And it is a comprehensive data classification, soup to nuts election security best practices that we are going to turn into an administrative rule eventually, but we want to roll it out, get buy-in from the counties and implement in the first round of implementation before we make a rule out of it. The other thing that it did is it requires counties to undergo an election security assessment. So we used our 2018 HAVA dollars to put in place a comprehensive assessment for every county in Texas of their election security posture, both cybersecurity as well as protective physical security. And so far, we've got almost 70 counties have undergone the assessments. The things that we're finding are the things that you would expect to find. And so we haven't been surprised with regard to the issues that we thought were out there. And we have money for remediation. So by the end of this summer, we expect to have about 245 of our 254 counties assessed, and we are well underway with our remediation process. The other thing that the legislature did in 2019 that's very important is they passed another bill, HB 4130, which gave us the ability, our office, the Secretary of State's office, to certify electronic poll books. Before that bill, it was the wild, wild west in Texas with regard to poll books. Any vendor could sell anybody anything. And so we very much appreciate the added level of scrutiny and security that we're giving our counties by certifying the electronic poll books. And I think that's my time.
David.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with my colleague, Keith and Jeff from the Government Coordinating Council. Again, my name is David Stafford. I run elections in Escambia County, Florida. That's Pensacola, the northwesternmost part of the state. We've got about 215,000 registered voters. We're considered a medium-sized county among Florida's 67 counties. And so let me first talk a little bit about the Government Coordinating Council. I think sometimes we assume that people, there's some level of understanding of exactly what GCC is and what it does. It was about 3 years ago, it was 3 years ago this month across the river there in Pentagon City, where we had an official from the Department of Homeland Security who was tasked with talking to a room full of election officials, state, local, election officials about basically telegraphing the fact that we were about to become part of the nation's critical infrastructure. My colleague and friend, Secretary Condos there, who spoke earlier, I think he was being a little bit diplomatic when he said when that announcement first came that there was some concern. Yeah. I can tell you it was more than a little concern. I think by all accounts, nobody really knew what that meant, from the election side as well as from the federal side. I think in those early days when we were trying to get the GCC established, it became very evident, I think, to a lot of election officials when we'd be sitting in a room with whether it was FBI or DHS officials, that there was some education. There was, I think, some level of understanding of how elections are actually run, particularly at the local level, that needed to happen. The good news is between that time and October of that year, which in my opinion, and being an observer for some years of the federal government is lightning fast, we had the Government Coordinating Council impaneled with a charter, and we were on our way. I can tell you this, that from my perspective, sitting as a member of the executive committee of the Government Coordinating Council and as a local election official in the state of Florida, that the difference between where we were 4 years ago today and then where we are today is like night and day, particularly as when it comes to cybersecurity and elections. Now, that's not doesn't mean that we're sitting back and resting on our laurels, because we also understand the threat has evolved, and has the threat risen commensurate with our level of preparation? I don't know. I hope not. But we certainly are continuing to do everything we can to raise our level of preparation in anticipation of the 2020 elections. I think a good example of that is the recent activity as it relates to what's going on in the Middle East with Iran. What has happened with Secretary Krebs? I have to give him a heck of a lot of credit. Not Secretary Krebs, the Director Krebs from CISA, who is doing, I think, a yeoman's job in communicating and handling groups of election officials and being very transparent and sharing a ton of information about the increased threat and activity that they were seeing as a result of some of the activities that were going on internationally. And that mechanism simply didn't exist 4 years ago. That would not have happened 4 years ago if the same incident, the same set of circumstances. So I think that is proof that we are making significant progress. We still have a long ways to go. For us here in the state of Florida, we've undertaken a lot, not only through the federal initiative, but also on our own. We've had 2 secretaries of state now. The current secretary, Secretary Lee, as well as her predecessor, have taken this issue of security very seriously. We've augmented the federal money and activities along with state activities. We're in the midst of completion of a joint election security initiative. So we're working very hard, understand the threats evolving, but certainly I think I don't think you can look at it and say we're not in a better situation and from preparedness than we were 4 years ago.
Amen.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, and thanks for the time and the opportunity to be here in this panel today. From our perspective, what I heard from all the panelists, and I would echo this from what we do as a global cybersecurity company, I heard focus and I heard diligence, and that's a consistent theme we see not only in the U.S. but also globally against an ever-evolving cyber threat landscape. The challenge, of course, in elections and these types of democratic institutions that we're trying to protect is they are critical, and that's been recognized. It is critical infrastructure, and it actually behaves much more like what you would consider other traditional critical infrastructure from the perspective of data privacy is not necessarily the top concern, which is not for most cybersecurity issues in the commercial space, privacy protection of data is the utmost focus. In elections, it's actually the integrity first and the availability, right? The systems have to be available for voting. I think the integrity of the system and the integrity of the results is sacrosanct. And so protecting that requires, a different type of focus. It requires a different type of investment in not just technology. So I think we've seen a lot of focus in certain verticals within the cybersecurity space around elections. But as we put up here on this infographic, there's really kind of a rich ecosystem here that attackers will attempt to and have attempted to exploit, and sometimes successfully. And the technology piece of it, at the very core of it, the actual election systems themselves, is only one component. And it's not necessarily the most vulnerable or the most visible to attack. And as we've seen in examples of email hacking and leaking, or strategic information operations, which my colleagues alluded to, from certain adversaries out there that want to manipulate, but not necessarily, stop an election or prevent an election from occurring, but just manipulate the overall perception of what's happening there, or even the results of it. It tends to be a much more complicated environment to try to secure from start to finish. Certainly speaking to the global threat landscape, we do see an evolving nature. I think the awareness, the overall focus and intensity and scrutiny, both from the public side as well as from the government, caretakers of these systems, is raising the bar. It's no question. It's making it more difficult for adversaries to undertake the exact same types of tactics that were used successfully in 2016 and some of the other elections that we've seen around the world since then. Doesn't mean that there isn't still an opportunity there that our adversaries would like to take advantage of if they could. And we're seeing, as is common in other cybersecurity threats, kind of a copy and paste effect as well. Other regimes and other adversaries around the world are starting to see the opportunity space in focusing on election systems, and we're seeing more sophisticated attacks against election activities in Southeast Asia, in Eastern Europe, which can help inform, obviously, the protection of our own systems, but it also paints a broader picture of the adversary and the threats aren't going away. We're certainly raising the bar against them, but we have to maintain that diligence and those long-term investments beyond the technology component that enhance our people, our process, our capabilities to detect and protect these systems from attack.
Thank you, panel. I'm going to ask a few questions myself, and then we'll move to the audience. So, question to all. It has now been 3 years since the critical infrastructure designation. Election officials are more familiar with DHS now and other new actors to the election space and vice versa. As you've mentioned, we've also experienced the 2018 midterm elections together during this time. What would you say your biggest lesson learned or takeaway from the last 3 years is informing your efforts in 2020? We'll start with you, Jeff.
Oh, thank you. Mine has to begin with communications. As has been alluded to, we didn't know who to reach or how to reach them in 2016, and we had not met the Election Assistance Commission. We made calls to the Federal Election Commission. We were misguided in where we were well-intended but misguided. When we rolled out the critical infrastructure designation, we had not sufficiently explained what it meant to stakeholders, what it meant down to the local jurisdiction, what it meant for election directors, what it meant for secretaries of state, and that it wasn't a federal takeover of elections. We dug our own hole, and so from that point, we have been committed to attempting to communicate what our intent here is, how we can add value, how both operationally and strategically engage with this sector for the security of elections.
Somebody else jump in on that?
I shared Jeff's statement that it is the communications that have drastically improved between us and the federal government since 2016. Case in point, Texas had a fairly widespread ransomware attack last year, and within hours of that attack, it was mainly directed toward law enforcement agencies, but within hours, DHS was on the phone with me asking if elections were impacted. Could they be of service? What could they do to help? And so that, again, that's just something that didn't exist in 2016. That rapid response and willingness to partner is something that is going to be very useful as we go into 2020.
I talked a little bit about it in my opening remarks, but we certainly have come a long way. The communications aspect, the information sharing, particularly with Florida was the first state, and toot our own horn here a little bit. We were the first state to become all local election officials in our state. We're the first state to have all of them become members of the EAC, the Elections Infrastructure ISAC. And so that level of information sharing, and then again, I think just the educational efforts among our federal partners, and then even among states, because states, we have a decentralized system of conducting elections here in the United States. And so from state to state, even sometimes within states, people do things significantly differently. So trying to understand that landscape, I think, informs everybody's efforts. But again, as I mentioned previously, just the level of information that's being pushed out, sometimes, quite frankly, can be a little overwhelming because you have to know what to do with that information that's getting pushed out and be able to discern what's really important. And I think that's one of the challenges that we all have in being able to discern from that information. What do we do about it? Because you can just keep pushing information out, and at some point you just kind of throw your hands up and say, I can't handle anymore. So the idea of being able to structure it in such a way that it becomes something that you can be useful to myself as a local election official, or Keith as a state election director, or Secretary Condos as a Secretary of State, or election vendors. Being able to do something with that information. So that, like I said, that information sharing is probably the single most important improvement I've seen over the course, but we still have a long ways to go.
To borrow from the press colleagues here, democracy dies in darkness, so does cybersecurity. We were in a lot of darkness in 2016 in terms of awareness, communications, and information sharing. I think I agree with the panelists here. That has improved tremendously in the past 3 or 4 years across the board. But I think, as was hinted at, it's not enough to just share information. It's not enough to just provide threat information. It's not enough to be aware of weaknesses in these systems. You have to be able to action it. You have to operate these systems as critical infrastructure. And so that takes a certain amount of investment and discipline in, again, process and operations and functionality that takes that information flow, applies it into your environment, takes that threat
DC is such
information,
a crazy town.
make sure it's reasonable and it's applied
They've
against
said
the risk
so many
frame that
words
makes
here,
sense,
and
right? These systems have to operate. We can't make them so
We haven't
secure
even
that
addressed-
no one can vote, right? We have to be aware of that access need, but we have to have a good risk analysis to put against that data. And then the states, the localities, and the federal government all together have to really have good playbooks and practice those playbooks, which you heard a little bit about earlier, to really get that muscle memory honed in, so that when something real is happening, you've practiced it, you understand the process, you understand the communications flows, you understand how to escalate and where to get help from and who you can reach out to in the private sector, in the government sector, and you can respond in a way that minimizes or mitigates the potential impact of an attack. We know that there's going to be attempts, right? We know that's going to happen. The question is, how do you detect them and respond to them in the most effective way possible, while also ensuring and communicating to all your stakeholders of what you've done, again, to ensure the integrity of the systems that are important for the voters and the trust of the system. So I think that is the next step that we've seen as a global vendor, from our perspective, that taking that information flow, applying it into the infrastructure and the ecosystem that you're responsible for, and operating it as securely as possible, as a natural function, just as you would running an election, all the mechanics that go into it. We just have to build that muscle memory, and we have to keep working on it. It'll take some more time, but we've made tremendous strides, I think, in the past couple of years.
Great. Another question to all. We know that election offices vary tremendously in terms of budget, staffing, the number of voters served, and other factors. What is being done in your states and organizations to reach smaller sized election offices and those with scarce IT resources? And what advice would you have for such election offices? Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. So we start by trying to share our understanding of risk. It's no secret that anything that touches the internet faces cyber threats. So we want to get that message out as broadly as possible. We begin by working with state election directors to understand how elections in their state are implemented. Each one has their own series of controls and countermeasures that help to manage and mitigate risk in that state, according to their own policies, their own decisions. We try to document that and then work with the state election director to identify some free and no-cost resources that DHS, that CISA can push out to those communities to advance their security. It could be our free trainings, it could be exercises, our vulnerabilities. We often like to start with vulnerability scanning and beginning with our information sharing and analysis center. Both are no cost to the individual. Both provide immediate benefit in terms of the information that can be shared to argue for more resources or help to manage your systems directly. Right now, we're working with 35 states that represent nearly 6,000 jurisdictions, and we've provided tailored products to those jurisdictions based on the inputs from their state election director.
So this is the most challenging area that we have to deal with. You heard earlier that there are 2,400 members of the EAC. We got about 6,000 more to go. So it's reaching that that local election official. I mentioned that Texas has 254 counties. We've got 113 of those have fewer than 15,000 people. So they do not have the resources that they need to face the threat that we face. And so that's where the federal money has come in very handy. The 2018 money is enabling us to assess the counties, figure out what their particular weaknesses are, and also help them fund remediation efforts so that they're not in this alone and we're not requiring them to do it all. In addition, our office has hired a couple of what we call election security trainers, and their job is to go to those counties that don't have IT support and be the IT support for that county to help them implement remediation measures on the ground in their county. So that's some of the things that we're trying to do to bridge that gap with the local election officials. Part of what we're having to overcome, at least in Texas, is the belief on the part of the local election officials that this whole cybersecurity thing in elections doesn't involve them. You know, it's their, who's going to come after me in Armstrong County, for instance. And so making sure that they understand that they're on the front lines, that they are very much a part of this is something that we've been working diligently to inculcate into their brains. And we've done that a number of ways. Homeland Security came to Texas and did a all-day tabletop exercise for county election officials. And I think that went a long way toward helping them realize that this does involve them. This matters to them. And that has had beneficial effects on making sure that they take us up on the election security assessments in a timely manner and reach out to us if anything happens. There was one other thing that HB 1421 did, and that is for the first time, it requires them to report if they do have any sort of election security incident. And so that reporting and information sharing, not just between the state and the feds, but between my counties and myself is something that's different in 2016 that we hope to build upon.
Well, one of the things that the state of Florida has implemented, in addition to our joint election security initiative, is the cyber navigators. And this was an idea, I think the first time I heard about it was my former colleague, Noah Prates, used to be in Cook County, Illinois, local election official here, who now works for the DHS. But Noah had this idea of hiring these cyber navigators, and Florida did the same thing. We've divided this state up into regions and had these folks that were funded at the state, by the state, but they were there as a resource for local election officials. And so you have, like I said, we've got 67 counties. Largest is a couple of them are over 1 million voters, and then we've got several that are fewer than 15,000 voters. And so the level of capabilities and resources are dramatically different within the state. And so how do you balance all of that out? Well, part of that is through this Cyber Navigator program in conjunction with the Joint Election Security Initiative to make sure everybody's at a certain baseline, and then helping them mitigate that, get up to that baseline if they're falling short in some form or fashion. The other way is that there's tremendous amount of resources. Sometimes it can be overwhelming. You have a lot of well-intentioned folks out there that are offering ideas and resources and playbooks and best practices, and trying to be able to sift through all of those. And what are these things that we can borrow at little or no cost, procedurally, or what are some of the things we can do without having to write a big check to some third party to be able to help increase your baseline. One of the challenges there is personnel. I mean, you can have these resources that are available to you, but you have to have people to be able to implement them as well. So it can become a challenge. But one of the ways I think a proven way is these cyber navigators that can act as a resource for a grouping of counties or a region, to where that if a county can't afford to have somebody on their staff to do this stuff, 40 hours a week. When needed, they can rely on them for some of their expertise.
Yeah, we often talk about something we term the cybersecurity poverty line, and that's not only talking about budget and funding, but it's also expertise and experience, and it's a real challenge, obviously, in systems and locations where very temporary need and very small staff. You can't expect that you're going to have a fully capable cybersecurity functionality at every single location. So I do see, and we've we endorse kind of this model of how can the state centralize, or at least, to the extent possible, help guide the resourcing and a lot of the information sharing components, as well as that information flow. Somebody said it, which I think is really smart, is up, not just down, but up. What are you seeing, and how do we help you manage the information you're seeing in your systems, and how do we help you monitor that equipment and test them for security vulnerabilities on a regular basis, so that you're adding that capability down to the local level without expecting them, which is frankly unrealistic, to be able to fund and resource at every single one of those locations the full suite of functionality. It's a common theme and trend in cybersecurity in general, is you concentrate the visibility and you centralize a lot of that visibility wherever you can. And then you take advantage of a concentrated focus and expertise, and you focus your resources and dollars as well. And I do think that pays a lot of dividends, and it really helps to, again, manage that risk at a state level, so you can understand what your threat picture looks like and your exposure looks like across the state, and you can apply resources intelligently to where it's most needed.
Keith, you mentioned the HAVA funds. So Keith and David, do you have a sense at this point how your states might choose to spend the newly appropriated 2020 HAVA funds?
So we're working through that process right now, trying to think about what's possible. For Texas, it's about $26 million in federal money with about a $5 million state match. So that sounds like a lot of money, but it's really not. That's about how much it would cost for Harris County alone to replace their voting machines. So we have to be smart about how we use it, so that we can get the biggest bang for our buck. Some of the things that we considered using the first round of HAVA dollars for, with regard to securing our endpoints for our voter registration database users, are some of the things that are back on the table now. So we've got some ideas, but we'll have to go through all of the process internally before we can talk about them.
Okay. David?
Oh, we don't know yet. We're getting upwards of $20 million. I don't know the exact dollar amount in Florida. We had an interesting process that followed the initial $380 million. Initially, the state said, we're not going to have time to implement this. And then there was such an outcry that said, hey, look, there's this federal money available and you can't just let it sit there. And so they're like, okay, well, then we're going to pull it down, but then you're going to have to spend every dollar of it prior to the 2018 general election. And, that's a good problem to have from a local level, but it's a problem nonetheless, because there's practical considerations about, how can you go out and spend. For me, just from my own standpoint, it's about $250,000 in my county alone. And what are the things, because there's multi-year efforts that we could have employed, but the guidelines that the state put on us at that time was use it or lose it. So we had to get creative in how we looked at what to invest in. I think it's safe to say we've had we learned from that experience. The state, I think, has learned from that experience. We've got a different administration, different Secretary of State, different governor. As I mentioned a couple of times, we're in the midst of completing this joint election security initiative. And so one of the things that we were fortunate, though, and I know that didn't happen in a lot of states, was that the funds did get pushed down to the local level, where, and again, a lot of that has to do with how elections are run in that particular state. If they're very state concentrated, then, I think there's a greater argument to be made to hold some of those funds at the state level. For us, the elections are run at the local level. So that's where the money went. And I know some of the other states had challenges, and some of the other localities had challenges getting some of those funds from the state. That just simply didn't happen. I don't expect that to happen again in Florida. So I think it's sort of a wait and see approach, but I think it probably is going to be incorporated into this joint election security initiative.
Ron, you mentioned this in your opening remarks. Your firm works on election cybersecurity both in the U.S. and internationally. Are there any particular lessons from the international environment that you think might be applicable to us here at home?
Yeah, a couple come to mind. So, again, we focus on, rightly so, a lot of the activity that we saw and was widely reported in 2016. Again, a lot of it was, both email hacking and leaking, strategic timing on that type of activity, as well as attempts to gain access, it looks like, to certain election systems throughout the country. So there's a combination of open information operation style activity and strategic leaking of sensitive information from a campaign or from candidates, combined with directed attacks at election systems. What we've seen internationally is a continuation, certainly, of the first part of that, the information operations domain, the media manipulation components, the ability to stand up these systems on social media outlets like Twitter and Facebook to amplify messaging, to create false narratives and false personas, and then get them out into the public domain. We see a lot of that activity continuing in Eastern Europe. We tracked a lot of focused information operations activity in the Ukrainian election that happened in January through March of this year, of 2019. What I'd say trend-wise is, if you look at the full life cycle and the forensic analysis, so to speak, of what happened in 2016, it was a fairly drawn-out process from the time some of these things were stood up to the time the activity they were used to actually take action. There was a fairly drawn-out life cycle. I think what we've seen is, especially in Russia's case, they're getting better or more sophisticated about the timing of these attacks. So they're not necessarily showing their cards or standing up these capabilities ahead of time because they know people are watching. They're aware of the fact that there's going to be directed, focused attention if somebody detects those types of preliminary activities. So in Ukraine's example, one example from that election was that some of these fake media sites that were pretty, fairly obvious when you look at them, they were actually only stood up during the runoff election 2 or 3 days prior to the final runoff election. So they weren't present. They weren't kind of built and out there for any length of time for anybody to react to. So the timing of these attacks we are anticipating are going to be much more narrowly focused, and if they're going to happen in this cycle. So we have to be, again, more diligent, but also much more cognizant of the reaction times to how we, again, partner at the government and private sector level to get that information out there, to take action against it, and to thwart those activities. The other action that I would say is new or fairly new in this space that we've observed in kind of the Southeast Asia region is not directed manipulation, or it doesn't appear to be, attempts to actually change outcomes of elections, but just straightforward espionage. So in other words, breaking into, again, campaigns and candidates and just tracking the likelihood of who's going to win. We think for purposes of longer term strategic analysis of, who those candidates and eventually those elected officials will be that they'll have to deal with from a bilateral or multilateral perspective on the world stage. And that's mostly, we attribute a lot of that activity currently to Chinese espionage activity. Regionally based, we don't really think that that's necessarily going to have a big play in U.S. elections, but it's something to look out for and to be considerate of it, which is, again, not just active measures or active activity, which is obviously the things that are going to get a lot of attention, but the long and persistent access and attacks into systems for purposes of just collecting information over a longer period of time that we have to be diligent about as well.
So David, you played a big role in helping the GCC draft its communications and information sharing protocols, and Keith and Jeff, feel free to jump in on this as well. Could you tell us more about those protocols and help our audience understand how information is shared among election officials and federal partners and how it's communicated to the general public?
Well, I'll start by saying that the communications protocols are currently being updated. And when the GCC meets later this month here in DC, I think the updated version will be presented to the full GCC for their adoption. The idea is trying to take us, and remember, these are voluntary protocols that the GCC adopted. Certainly the federal agencies have their own internal protocols about how information is shared. But the idea is how do you look at this from all levels and put some parameters around when information should and should not be shared. So it's evolving, coming from the state of Florida. You all may have noticed that there was some activity that was after the Mueller report was released, was published. There was some reference. There was a line or two that referenced Florida, and I think what happened as a result of all that certainly shined a light on how it shouldn't work. Because I think all people involved agreed that the way that the information was or was not shared, that's not the way it should be. So the idea is for when something happens at the federal level, getting that information, first of all, as much information as is possible to be shared without revealing classified information to people that aren't cleared to have classified information, should be shared as quickly as possible, and it should be actionable, and it should be released through the normal channels as quickly as possible. I think you heard from the ODNI earlier that they have a big commitment to try to get as much of that information downgraded so it can be shared widely, and I think we've made great progress on that. And then the other aspect is, again, as we all mentioned, is on the way up. What if something happens at a local level? What are the communication sharing protocols to get that information shared within your state to the federal government, and then broadly beyond that? And I think that's part of where some of this conversation is, this relationship between the state and the localities, and the localities and the state, and what are the parameters that says, okay, if an incident happens at the state level, when is it incumbent upon the state to share that information with the locals, and then vice versa? I think there's broad agreement, and I think what you'll see coming out of these communication sharing protocols, these updated versions, is that when an incident does happen within a state, in a locality, that information is shared with the state entity that certifies elections, whether it's the Secretary of State or the equivalent. So that's something that's continuing to be looked at, but it's trying to get as much information shared within the community, state, federal, even the private sector partners as possible. We think it will increase the resilience of the subsector in whole.
Do you have anything?
So,
No. You want to add something? Okay.
For us, the communication protocols were to help clarify the expectations that DHS was committed to sharing information in certain capacities. Victim notification is actually fairly easy. You go to the victim, you tell those that are accountable for that. But this has such a broad gray area of information that we've made the determination that for us, it's best in the hands of the network operators. So we're trying to push down as much as possible. Scanning activity, things that fall short of victim information should still be shared as much as possible to the community. That's where we tried to document this in our communications protocols and commit ourselves to that as much as possible.
Thanks. So we'll take some questions from the audience now. If anybody has a question, just raise your hand. Remember to speak into the microphone, give us your name and affiliation, and be brief and actually ask a question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Mark Lindeman from Verified Voting. Jeff, you mentioned risk limiting audits, a topic I think about now and then. Could you or others talk about how post-election audits and maybe other procedures can help to secure election infrastructure, but also possibly to counter social media disinformation?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. We view efficient and effective post-election audits as a risk countermeasure, the ability to detect any type of manipulation of votes. So we think the horizon for election security is improving auditability first, and then the conduct of post-election audits. And obviously the ability to go back and reference statistically valid findings for post-election audits that suggest that there is no tampering or no manipulation of the vote should have a confidence building effect.
Other questions?
That hasn't happened. The opposite happened.
Along those same lines, the new technology for scanners requires that a digital image be taken of each ballot that's inserted into the scanner. And it's from that digital image that the ballot tally is taken. So that digital image then becomes a very important part of the public record and is fully auditable because you can take those images and line them up and count them. It could be done at the kitchen table if your uncle was running for sheriff, for example, and you wanted to audit that election. So that's a new risk limiting audits have been in the news for quite a few years now, but the valid image audits are equally valid.
Do you have a question?
Just wanted to make that point
Okay.
because it hasn't been publicized very extensively yet.
I wonder if that's true.
Other questions for our panelists? Right here?
Hi, Eric Geller from Politico. So Keith, a lot of counties in Texas continue to use paperless voting machines. A lot of them actually bought new ones a couple of years ago. What are you doing to communicate to them about the risk of those machines? And then maybe Jeff, if you could also weigh in on how nationwide you try to make these points, given that there are a lot of reasons why officials still like them and still continue to buy them.
So all the voting systems that are certified for use in Texas can produce a secure election if they're used in accordance with the certification and our advisory with regard to the use of electronic voting systems. We have told counties who have purchased DREs since the last legislative session, there have been a couple of them, and we're putting in our approval letter. We have to approve every contract that a county purchases voting system equipment to make sure it's certified equipment. And we're putting in our letter a reminder to them that the legislation almost passed requiring paper audit trails, and that probably it will pass next time. And so they could be wasting their money and have to spend it again. So we put in that paragraph in our approval letters these days for folks who buy DREs. But the majority of counties are buying some sort of ballot marking device with a paper trail. We have the majority of voters in Texas are going to vote with a paper system this March primary.
Our understanding is that for the 2020 election, between 90 and 92% are likely to have an auditable record for their vote. That's progress, and so we'll continue to communicate.
That's just not
with the
true.
sector, our view of risk and work not just for 2020, but for 2022 and 2024 and beyond, how we can improve the security posture across the sector.
Other questions about security? Somebody up here?
Claytor Butler from Akamai Technologies, security specialist, consultant for the hemisphere. The government has a particularly long tail in software lifecycle management, remediation of vulnerabilities from the point that they are identified to when they're actually remediated. And that can get in the way of incident response, and especially if you've got days before an election, you find that there's a critical vulnerability in a system, or, heaven forbid, there's an actual attack on infrastructure during the election. My question is, what is being done to shorten that time? What best practices can you share to shorten that remediation time between identification and remediation so that problems aren't fixed after it's too late?
Good question.
So I'll begin by saying that there are tools in place for broad situational awareness of threats occurring during operational voting windows, like our cyber situational awareness room last election cycle had more than 600 election officials in there sharing scanning activity, sharing anything that they wanted to validate from our federal partners, whether there was anything malicious behind the activity scene. So that is a mechanism for rapid just operations floor, watch floor type of information. But you're talking more about the ability to share and disseminate vulnerability information. And this is where I'd have to actually lean on a lot of election officials and their planning and preparedness to, they can pull systems out of service. They've previously been able to conduct elections when the power goes out, when all these other continuity of operations take place. So as long as we can share the information, I have confidence that they're able to run the election with integrity.
You're
From our
crazy. Then.
perspective, it's of course a laudable goal to shrink the time, especially for critical vulnerabilities, from time of detection or awareness to time of remediation. But we have to learn. I mean, frankly speaking, and this is the advice we give to all of our customers, you have to learn to live in an environment that will have vulnerabilities, either known or unknown, that you can't action by definition. So therefore, we go back to the premise that we talked about earlier, which is you have to have systems and mechanisms in place to monitor those systems, to validate the integrity of those systems, and to react to anomalous activity on those systems. We advocate and we actually implement at both state and local levels for many of our customers this concept of pre-election hygiene activities. So there are certain, I mean, it is critical infrastructure. There's certain periods of time where you can't touch them because they're in a window of integrity prior to and after an election and during an audit. But certainly there are windows of opportunity where we prepare for the next cycle, especially the higher visibility ones, where we have a series of activities. One of those activities is high value asset scanning, vulnerability assessment, but you have to prioritize because you're likely to come back with thousands of problems that you have to focus on, and you can't get them all fixed in the window you have. And there's probably going to be a lot of new ones every time around, and you rely on the election system vendors to, in many cases, patch them, and they might not be you might not be able to in that cycle. So you have to live with some limitations. So what else do we do in that cycle? We also encourage system operators to not just look for vulnerabilities, but look for evidence that there has been unauthorized activity in the environment. Look for evidence of compromise. Look for evidence of targeting, right? So that you can combine not just the potential with the vulnerability, but the actual threat. Are we seeing an intersection? That raises the concern much higher than just simply saying we have a vulnerability, but maybe it's not visible to the outside world. Maybe they're not targeting that type of vulnerability. Maybe there's no capability against it. Maybe they're just not interested, right? So being able to have that risk analysis that says intent combined with availability, or intent combined with the ability to action that intent, is important. And being able to do that on a cyclical basis and be able to bring that up to an election official level and give them a red, yellow, green, and give them a confidence level going into each election is critically important. So we like to look at it as a combined effort that doesn't simply focus on the technical vulnerabilities, but how that ecosystem is operating and where to prioritize your risk reduction each cycle and prepare for the next one.
So with that, we'll need to conclude our panel. I'm sorry. I know there's probably more questions out there.
Horrible.
But I think our panelists will be around if you want to ask your question. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
Utterly underwhelming. Utterly underwhelming. This had nothing to do with anything, and they just said BMDs were the answer.
We'll now take
Basically.
a 20-minute.
Terrible.
Is that right? 20 minutes,
I'm
and
very
resume
disappointed.
With our final panel,
I am very, very
moderated by
disappointed.
EAC Commissioner Don Palmer at 2:50 p.m.
Terrible.
Thank you.
Terrible.
Thank
It's
you so
terrible.
much.
What's happening here is terrible. It's just terrible. When you have terrible things happening like that, it's just terrible. That's just the worst. That was the election security panel of the EAC 2020 election summit. Utterly underwhelming is what that is.